I think we'll get going. Welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to see so many at our inaugural event for the online part of the Xenophon Society. Of course, the International Xenophon Society has been around for several years now. Um, and the executive committee decided that this would be a lovely occasion to sort of, there's someone else in the waiting room, to introduce to people or remind you about the first volume in the Xenophon Studies series, a new monograph series with de Gruyter, edited by Christopher Tuplin, Gabriel Danzig, and myself. This handsome tome is the first in the series, Xenophon's Virtues, edited by Gabriel Danzig, David Johnson, and David Konstan, who very sadly passed away, and so is not able to be here with us. But it was published just last year. And hang on, let one more person in. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to the editors, to Gabriel and Dave, to just introduce the volume, tell us a bit about it. And then we have a lineup of some junior scholars who will give us responses to it after that. And then we'll have just general discussion, questions for everyone at that point. So yes, let me hand over to the editors. And let me know, anyone, if you need to be made co-host at any point.
I think I was assuming that Gabriel would go first, so I could disagree with him. That was our plan, or at least my plan.
Okay. Yeah, that's what Dave suggested. For whatever reasons. So let me begin. First of all, thank you, Emily, for organizing this online event. It's a real honor to participate in it. This book emerged from a research project on Xenophon's virtues. As part of the project, I was given funding to organize a conference in Israel, and it was there at Kibbutz Tzuba that the society that came together, which Christopher was the first, and Emily the second distinguished president. It was there that Dave Johnson and I became friends with David Konstan, who helped edit this volume and also helped bring the Xenophon book series into existence. I chose the subject of virtue because it seemed the logical next step in the development of Xenophon studies. It had become well known, partly because of Vivian Gray's writings, that leadership is the central theme of virtually all of Xenophon's writings. Virtue is a crucial element of leadership, and the focus on virtue seemed to be a useful way to bring Xenophon into dialogue with Plato. Although the book was not officially dedicated to comparative studies, I hoped it would serve as a useful step towards that aim. I will briefly share two findings from the research that I did for this volume. I noticed that Xenophon, and Plato too, uses the term arete almost exclusively in the singular. This means that it's a mistake to speak of Xenophon's virtues in the plural. So the title of our book is actually wrong. As many scholars have noted, arete means nothing more or less than excellence. Just as we do not speak of many excellences in English, so too Xenophon does not speak of many aretae. That came later with Isocrates and Aristotle. Strictly speaking, Eusebeia, Sophia, Sophrosune, Dikaiosune, Andrea, and Enkritheia are all components of virtue, not independent virtues. Connected with this, virtue seems to be a quality that is embodied in a particular person and that differs from person to person. When Xenophon speaks of Agesilaus arete, he's speaking about a specific instance of arete and acknowledging that not every virtuous person has the same virtue combination that Agesilaus had. One implication of all this relates to the claim that enkritheia is not a virtue. This turns out to be unintelligible or irrelevant, since none of these qualities is a virtue. They're all components of virtue. Once we put it that way, it's easy to maintain that enkritheia is a component of virtue too, and perhaps the most essential component of all. In an earlier version, which I didn't publish, I compared arete to an ice cream cone. Enkritheia is the cone. And without it, there can be no ice cream cone. But the ice cream cone is also composed of the various flavors of ice cream that one puts in it. Enkritheia is an outlier in this set because it's not a form of ice cream, but it's no less essential a component than the others, and even more so since it is the foundation of the entire construct. This gives Xenophon a position similar to that of Protagoras in Plato's dialogue by that name. We can talk about that more if people find it interesting. The other insight that I offered is that the traditional virtue qualities, all of those except enkritheia, which was invented in the 4th century, are not qualities of the soul, but qualities of action. Or rather, since all of them are qualities of the soul in some sense, the traditional virtue qualities are defined not by their effect on the soul, but by their effect on action. Having arete does not mean having a healthy soul. It means being able to do lots of stuff really well. Andrea enables courageous action, while dikaiosune enables just action and is not, as Plato claimed, a special ordering of the soul itself. In this respect, Xenophon's approach reflects an ordinary understanding of arete that was common before, after, and even during Plato's Republic. The theory of virtue in the Republic is a radical reworking of Greek concepts, completely unreliable for understanding ordinary Greek thought. Plato is far too schematic. His division of the soul into 3 parts explains his dropping of piety, which he includes in the Protagoras, from the list of cardinal virtue components. With only 3 parts of the soul, one can only have 3 virtues, or at most 4, if one includes a virtue of the soul as a whole. The same is true for Aristotle, who ruthlessly bends every concept into a preordained philosophical scheme. If Plato and Aristotle are creative philosophers, Xenophon is more of an honest philologist. Of course, that too is an overstatement. Xenophon was a thinker, and thinkers tend to try to make sense out of things. But it seems to me that Xenophon tries to make sense out of the virtue terminology while sticking close to its ordinary meaning. He does not dismiss current concepts in order to construct an alternative account of virtue, but rather tries to give order to existing concepts with some inevitable but minor alterations along the way. For example, look at what he does with Sophrosune and Sophia. In Memorabilia 3.9, Xenophon claims that all the virtue qualities are identical to Sophia. But he also claims in a separate paragraph that Sophrosune is identical to Sophia. If that is not redundant, it seems to indicate that Sophrosune is more closely identified with Sophia than the other virtue qualities. Some commentators deny that Xenophon actually means to equate the two. Dorian argues that Xenophon is simply saying that they are not separable, that Sophrosune is always found together with Sophia. In his view, Xenophon equates Sophrosune with enkritheia instead. But the identity of Sophrosune and enkritheia is even more problematic and more Platonizing than the equation of Sophrosune and Sophia. How can Sophia and Sophrosune be the same thing if they have different semantic ranges? I suggest that Sophrosune means the ability to act well, for reasons that are never completely clear to the Greeks, but seem connected with some intellectual and emotional balance. See the phrase esophrones for the intellectual aspect. That can be equated with Sophia only if Sophia refers not to theoretical wisdom, but to practical wisdom. It must be, like Sophrosune, a quality that produces good action. Indeed, for Xenophon, Sophia means practical wisdom, a quality that Plato and Aristotle sometimes, but not always, refer to as phronesis. The identity of these terms explains why, in the Apology, Socrates takes the oracle's praise of his Sophrosune as a praise of his Sophia. This implies that Plato and Aristotle have restricted the term Sophrosune to a much more limited range than it had in normal speech. Plato makes it a form of enkrateia, and Aristotle limits it still further by making it self-restraint in respect to the sense of touch. Why do they do that? I suggest that they do this in order to make room for the purely intellectual virtues. If a traditional virtue like Sophrosune can provide good guidance in life, why would a person need to cultivate more purely intellectual qualities by restricting Sophrosune to the emotional realm? Plato and Aristotle are able to distinguish it from the more important intellectual qualities of phronesis and Sophia that they wish to explore and develop. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. Handing over to Dave.
Okay, well, I, as advertised a moment ago, have taken the distinctly unvirtuous tack of disagreeing with my two co-editors about one of the central things that the volume discusses, which is the sort of whether Xenophon is playing the same game as Plato and Aristotle when it comes to virtue. So what we're arguing about is whether Xenophon recognizes virtues as a distinctive class of positive traits. Xenophon recognizes that expression is a bit ambiguous. Does it require explicit definitional statements outlining what virtue means as a category term? In that case, Xenophon certainly does no such thing. But this could be due more to the way in which he wrote than to his distinctive ideas about virtue. As Gabriel well points out in his introductory chapter to the volume, even when Xenophon provides us with definitions, in the Socratic works mainly, they're so curt that they require considerable interpretation. We therefore turn to other sorts of work, like the Colloquium of Agesilaus, that is David Konstan's chief text in his closing contribution to our volume. Xenophon in that work pulls out all the stops in praise of Agesilaus, hence covering lots of territory well beyond what we are comfortable assigning to virtue in any very exact sense of that term. Xenophon's account of Agesilaus may also engage in some special pleading meant to show Agesilaus virtuous even at the cost of muddying what counts as virtuous. I think that's what's going on when Xenophon says that Agesilaus was courageous at the Battle of Coronea, for example, where he foolishly charged headlong into a Theban force that he could have hit on the flank. So at least some differences between Xenophon on the one hand and Plato and Aristotle on the other will reflect genre rather than differences about the nature of virtue. Or as Christopher put it so well in his chapter in our volume, it's the sort of show not tell aspect of Xenophon's writings. Now, Gabriel and David Konstan, agree that what Gabriel calls virtue qualities are different in kind, I think. I think they're in agreement on that. Now, consider the 6 qualities that Gabriel, in his overview chapter, considered the most central for Xenophon. They are enkrateia, eusebia, dikaiosune, andrea, sophrosune, and sophia. I will pause to note that if we can agree that certain terms are central, this would suggest that Xenophon might have some kind of class in mind. But moving on, how do they differ? Right? They differ in their areas of influence. This not only in the familiar sense that courage and justice appear to apply in different situations, but that Sophrosune and Sophia appear to refer to virtue in its entirety. The qualities also differ in their means of acquisition, some coming by practice, others more by instruction. They also differ in that one of them, enkrateia, is what Gabriel calls a quality of the soul rather than a quality of action. That is, it's something that leads something that's more internal than external looking. I'm going to take the last point first. So I don't think enkrateia belongs on this list because I'm one of the people who continues to believe that it does make sense to say that it isn't a virtue. It is the, or at least a foundation of virtue. I hedge with a V or A because in my chapter on Andrea, I identify strength of soul as something that also seems to be foundational to at least one virtue, to Andrea, though I think enkritheia may also be required for courage. Enkritheia also differs from the other terms in that it's not as normative as the others. Here I'm largely in agreement with Gabriel, but I think he understates enkritheia's tendency to inhibit desires that lead us in the wrong direction. That is, I tend to buy Xenophon's argument that Socrates' enkritheia is evidence for his justice, rather than making that argument an effort to leverage a trait all would grant that Socrates was encratic, in order to defend his justice and piety, which were more controversial, which is Gabriel's, I think, subtle and fascinating take on why Xenophon makes so much of enkritheia. But what of the heterogeneity of the other terms on the list? Luckily enough for me, Gabriel takes Andrea, the Xenophonic virtue I thought the most about, as his example of the odd virtue quality out. Andrea and Gabriel's terms consist mainly in skill fighting with weapons, and it is a quality that can be harmful, as Agesilaus' misguided courage at Coroneo almost was. I guess it was harmful in the sense that he was badly wounded, but he won the battle. I've already dealt with that battle and mentioned that I think it's not an example of true courage. As to training in weapons, I would say that certain forms of expertise widen one's opportunity to display courage. To fight bravely as a hoplite, you need to have some basic training in hoplite fighting. Without that training, you wouldn't do anyone any good trying to fight in that way, any more than you would succeed in fighting as a hoplite without a spear and a shield. But fighting courageously as a hoplite still requires you to do so for the sake of the colon, for what is fine. It still requires that you be willing to risk your life. My chapter points out that Xenophon says surprisingly little about courage, because his approach to leadership requires leaders to reduce the risks for those they lead. So the most marked examples of courage in Xenophon tend to be last stands. And as the good leader should avoid leading his men into last stands. These are a specialty of bad leaders. But their bravery in choosing to go down fighting is admirable and virtuous as far as it goes. So that much is very briefly for attempt to, I guess, bring Xenophon's a version of Andrea back into the fold with the more philosophical types. Sophia and Sophrosune are different from the rest of the terms on the list in another respect, in that each appears to apply to the whole of virtue, and they cannot be distinguished from each other. I think I'm basically in agreement with Gabriel about the range of Sophrosune, which can encompass pretty much any form of good action in some sense. Sophia is, I think, a broader term. I take it to be the genus of which Sophrosune is one species. Sophrosune is practical wisdom, kintophronesis. Practical wisdom is the knowledge that allows one to act in a sophron way. So Sophia and Sophrosune encompass the other virtue terms, but so too does Sophia in early Plato. Gabriel makes at least three other points that distinguish Xenophon from Plato and Aristotle. I conveniently have enough time only to address them superficially. First, Gabriel argues, following Rosalind Royce, that Xenophon distinguishes between doing one's duty, which sometimes people choose not to do, and doing what one considers advantageous, which Xenophon clearly says that we always do, in keeping with, I think, the early Platonic Socrates. Of this distinction from Weiss and Danzig, I will say only that it appears to rely on what is probably the most difficult passage in Xenophon's Socratic works, Memorabilia 394, which I read differently. Another point Gabriel makes is that for Xenophon, salutary opinions count as virtuous. I will say that this applies in his treatment, at least in the first place, to soldiers whose courage may not count as fully virtuous. I made a distinction in my chapter between the courage of a soldier and the courage of a general, for example. I'll add that belief could be the genus of which knowledge is the preferred species, as passages about Sophia in the Socratic works suggest. Finally, Gabriel argues that virtuous activity is not inherently pleasurable for Xenophon, unlike, say, Aristotle, quite clearly. But it is also true that Xenophon Socrates argues that the highest pleasure comes in consciousness of one's own improvement. That sounds like pleasure taken in virtue as a quality of soul, come to think of it. So to conclude then, what I'm suggesting, as is my wont, is that we not underestimate Xenophon's Socratic inheritance. There's certainly a risk of reading Plato and or Aristotle into Xenophon, but there's also a risk of reading Socrates out of him and assuming that he reflects traditional pre-philosophical ideas. The most virtual approach here, no doubt, would be a mean. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And what a beautifully dialogic presentation. And it's actually making me think we should maybe 5 to 10 minutes of discussion at this point before everyone forgets their thoughts. So if there are any responses to Gabriel, to Dave, at this stage, I suggest we put up your hand or simply unmute and start speaking because it's always a bit difficult on Zoom. Any responses so far? And if not, we'll get going. Norman, nice to see you there, Norman.
Hey everyone, great to see you. I have missed you so much. It's wonderful to see you. I just have what I hope is kind of a quick question, but I'm wondering either for Gabriel or Dave, again, great to see you both. What is a philia for Xenophon? And I know philia, it's normally translated as friendship, but I mean it here as that first word you always see in words like philokindunia or philanthropia or philomatheia. So just using that word, a philia, not as friendship, but as a love of something or a drive to do something. Is a philia is it type of virtue? Is it part of arete? Is it a feature of the soul? Is it separate from those? I'm just curious about your thoughts on that. And again, thanks.
Who is that to?
You started speaking, so you're stuck saying something first.
Either one of you.
Well, I can say something empirical about it. I can say that those terms don't appear on lists of virtues. So they must be something else. They seem, from that passage that you so, in such a wonderful way, you discuss in your book, it seems that these are natural inclinations that people are born with to a greater or lesser extent, and then maybe could be developed into virtues or could form a basis for some further development. But that's about all I can really say about it.
I think that's helpful. I mean, I think it might, one of the ways I've been trying to come to terms with some of these terms is certain things, like, at least in my view, enkriteia and also strength of soul are kind of substrates of virtue. And they are traits that one is born with more or less of. And perhaps these, the three philia traits that Cyrus has are more are akin to those in some ways, as reflecting different natural aptitudes that some of us are born with more of than others that make us more likely candidates to become virtuous. But that's something, definitely to think more about.
Luke.
Yeah, thanks. Lower hand. Thanks very much. I mean, there's very much to think about, I think. I mean, I wonder whether Gabriel maybe or Dave, could you say more about, well, on the one hand, I mean, is it sensible per se to talk about decontextualized virtues? Right? Isn't one of the great things about Xenophon that he gives us such rich contextualizations, that on the one hand, but combined with that, could you say something more about maybe what I would call prescriptive and descriptive ethics right? So if you are X, if you have virtue X, then in this or that situation you should do Y. But oh, Gabriel's now immediately gone. Oh, he's back. Okay. Or does Xenophon, certainly in his narrative works, Hellenica, and even Agesilaus in a sense, which is a post, hoc sort of thing, is it more like, ooh, he did that? That clearly was very brave, so that behavior becomes, with hindsight, a reason to categorize things in certain ways. I mean, do you see those two things also related to genre in Xenophon? I hope I make myself clear.
Dave, you want to try that one first?
Yeah, I mean, I think you said a number of different clear things, right? So, I mean, genre certainly matters. I mean, I think we'd all agree, right? And I that the range of genres in Xenophon are going to influence the way he describes activities, right? And that when you compare what Xenophon says about a virtue to what Plato says about a virtue, if you're looking at a fairly discursive philosophical passage in Plato and you're looking at, the Hellenica in Xenophon or the Agesilaus even, you're going to see some differences that are due to genre. So the difficulty then is teasing out what's due to genre and what's due to differences about ideas about virtue, right? So, I mean, what's at stake in this little dispute about whether we should speak of virtues or not, right? Is it a different idea about different understanding of virtue, or is it just a greater and lesser degree of kind of concept formation or abstraction? And I guess I'm leaning a little bit more towards the putting more weight on the generic differences. And I think this is fair. Let's see what Gabriel says about the Gabriel is thinking it's more about sort of, I don't know, deeper or a difference in ideas about just different understandings of virtue. I don't know. I hope that's at least, maybe I just rephrased your question, but it's at least some response.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks. Yeah.
Gabriel, did you want to add something there? Nope, disappeared. So, Gabriel, did you want to add something there?
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with the fact that, Xenophon isn't interested in abstract definitions nearly as much as Plato and Aristotle, that's for sure. He depicts them in narratives. But of course, you can think about a narrative, and I think that that's partly what we're supposed to do when we read them. And, I think as an intelligent person, Xenophon probably had some opinions and thoughts about what these things are, which is why he would portray them in certain ways. So I think you can bring out from the narrative some implicit understanding that underlies his thinking, even if that wasn't his real interest. And maybe better. Maybe people who think like that are a little bit more honest and accurate about what's going on. And I think that probably as a result of this, there's more contradictions, between different things that Xenophon says. We sort of took as a hypothesis that it all agrees with itself. But I would want to leave a little room for variation and contradiction between different passages.
Okay, wonderful. Let's hand over to Malcolm. Your question.
Yes, do you hear me?
Yes.
You hear me? No, I just wanted to make a remark about philia. It's obviously different from virtues because a virtue is related to a one-place predicate about which you apply to a person, whereas philia is refers to a two-place predicate between two people. So philia certainly has a place in the discussion of ethics, as of course Aristotle does so, but you can't call it a virtue. You're dealing with, of course. In the ancient world, there was this confusion about, that you could have 2 or 3 place predicates. It only became clear to people little more than a century ago. And of course, philo, like in philately or something like that, is again it's a relationship between a person and say and an object or a certain study. But it's always we always have a 2-place relation, and so it doesn't belong amongst the list of virtues. This is a very simple point.
Okay, do we have any final short point before we move on to the next stage of our presentation? I think we'll move on. And I realize I forgot to give our speakers institutional affiliations. I should have said that Dave Johnson is at Southern Illinois University at Carbondale and Gabriel Danzig at Baragwanath University. So my apologies for that. And now we will move on to our 3 more junior scholars to respond to either one chapter or any aspect of the volume that they saw fit, that they were interested in. So we'll begin with Chiara Lali. Hopefully I'm pronouncing that correctly, from Louvain-la-Neuve. I'll hand over to you, Chiara, right now. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. First of all, thanks for having me. I'm very happy and honored to be here. So today I will have the pleasure to comment on Professor Marsico's very interesting chapter, Preeminent in Phronesis, Xenophon and Aristotle on the Intellectual Virtues. So Marsico in this chapter proposes an intertextual reading of Xenophon and Aristotle because beyond their differences, the notions that Aristotle combines in his description of the process that leads to judgment and moral action described in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 6, are compatible with Xenophon's views. So let's see what this compatibility consists of. So first of all, in Nicomachean Ethic, we find established a tight link between phronesis and eubulia. So I quote from Nicomachean Ethics 1141 B8. So prudence, on the other hand, is concerned with the affairs of men, the phronesis perita anthropina, and with things that can be the object of deliberation. Kai perionon esti buleus estai. For we say that to deliberate well is the most characteristic function of the prudent man. So we understand here that the person who has phronesis, the phronimos, is the one who can well deliberate, the person who can eubuleuestai. And Xenophon seems to have the same idea about phronesis and eubulia, and we see that in Cyropedias with the character of Chrysantas, but I'm going to focus here on Xenophon's Apologies and on Socrates. In fact, here it is Socrates, the phronimos, who can well deliberate, and he well deliberates about the end of his life. In fact, he concludes that death is a better option than living in the current conditions he finds himself in, and that's why he prepares such a grandiloquent defense that wasn't intended to provoke the judge's mercy. Then his megalegoria wasn't proof of the fact that Socrates was being aphron, but quite the contrary, it is the outcome of his phronesis. Furthermore, Aristotle and Xenophon treat similarly the notion of synesis. So let's start from Aristotle. Aristotle introduced it in the following way in Nicomachean Ethics. So prudence issues commands, since its end is a statement of what we ought to do or not to do, whereas synesis merely makes judgments. So de synesis criticae monon. So basically, for Aristotle, synesis consists in outlining the best possible options, and it is the conclusion of boulesis. So Xenophon seems to make the same use of synesis in the Synergeticus, and there he attributes synesis to hunters. In fact, hunters' peculiar characteristic is that of synesis because they have to make swift and accurate decisions that enable them to immediate action. Notwithstanding that, we always have to keep in mind that both in Aristotle's account, both in Xenophon's account, sunesis doesn't only carry a positive sense, but it can also be used for bad outcomes. For example, always in the Synergeticus, and more precisely in the Synergeticus 13.14, sunesis is also attributed to sophists. And sophists are hunters too, but they are hunters of people, which is, of course, bad. So the sophists are said to have intellectual virtues, and their sunesis allowed and even encouraged them to hunt their prey. However, the viciousness of the sophists shows that they use only some intellectual virtues and do not achieve the full integration known as phronesis. So the problem here is that the sophists have the strength, they have the virtues, but they don't have the gnomen. Then, once we've made a decision, we have to put it into practice. And Aristotle says that there's a specific dunamis that helps us to do the things that conduce to the aim we propose. And this sort of dunamis we call deinotes. Xenophon seems to make the same use of deinos instead of deinotes, and they both agree on the ambiguity of deinos as the first tazimon of Sophocles' Antigonus recites. So deinotes could actually lead to achieving marvelous things as well as terrible things. And in the last categories on which Aristotle and Xenophon would agree is that of agrasia. And I'm just going to quote Xenophon's Agesilaus 11.9, where Agesilaus says that it is a greater misfortune to neglect good things knowingly, gignosconta, than to do so in ignorance, agmunta. So in sum, Marsico's idea is that Aristotle's account of intellectual virtues may well have been influenced by the subtle description we find in Xenophon. This would be possible given that Aristotle very likely read Xenophon, and this idea was first suggested by Mayer in his monography Socrates of 1913 against the ideas of Barnett, who had a really low opinion of Xenophon as a philosopher and as a Socratic source. However, Mayer pointed out that Memorabilia 4.6 could have been the principal source for Aristotle's representation of Socrates in his metaphysics as a philosopher primarily concerned with definitions and with the question of the essence, with the question of the theesti. Dorian too more recently argued in 2018 that some Aristotle's description of Socrates seemed to depend on Xenophon and not on Plato. I think that this is a point of great importance and originality because not only Xenophon becomes important to reconstruct Socrates' identity, but he also is important as someone who has influenced Aristotle's thought. Then an intertextual approach, as this chapter, can help us to gain a richer and more nuanced understanding of ancient thought and problems. That's why I think that ethical reflection, at least when it comes to the ancient Greek context, is not solely confined to philosophy, and this chapter captured this aspect very well. And in fact, it was able to demonstrate that even Xenophon's more technical, historical, and narrative works, such as the Cyropaedia or the Synergeticus, too provide us with description of the deliberation process. So on this note, to conclude, I would like to share a suggestion that, of course, is open to discussion. So since Professor Marsikos quoted the first tazimon of the Antigone to shed light on the lexical and ethical ambiguity of the notus deinos, I reread the tragedy and I've noticed that, more broadly speaking, the lexicon of deliberation we found in Aristotle or Xenophon might also be present in Sophocles' Antigone. So we know that Aristotle admires Sophocles. There are hints of that in the Poetics, where we read that the character must be spudaios, otherwise we won't feel pity for them. And we know that the main traits of the Sophoclean hero is precisely to be spudaios. As Kirby remarks in the companion to Sophocles published by Blackwell Publishing of 2012, he writes, overall, it is Sophocles whose work is the most closely aligned with the criteria that the Aristotelian system requires and celebrates. And for what concerned the connection between Xenophon and Sophocles, well, they were contemporaries, so I can guess that Xenophon simply benefited from the cultural milieu of his times. So where can we find Aristotle and Xenophon deliberative lexicon in Sophocles' Antigonus? So first of all, I think that Antigonus' trajectories in some sense parallel to that of Socrates in the Apologies, because both characters, they both have phronesis because they both well deliberate about the end of their lives. And in fact, in the Apology, at the verse 95, Antigonus says that, let me take this risk, and of course she is referring to burying her brother, with my dysboulian, so that I won't have an ignoble death. And when Antigonus is saying dysboulia instead of eubulia, I think that she's being ironic because she knows that she's being virtuous because she's appealing to higher nomoi. This is precisely the point of the tragic anyway. Besides, another element of compatibility is that both dimensions of the eupraxia, both the intellectual and the more practical and executive parts, are distinguished in the tragedy. In fact, this is clear from the verse 267, where Creon's guard tells Creon that he's ready to chase after for who had of those who had planned buleusanti and realized it, erges meno. And of course, here we are referring to the person who disobeyed to Creon's order to not bury Antigonus' brother corpse. So furthermore, I think that Ismene, namely Antigone's sister, could be a good candidate for the Acratic person because she says that she doesn't have the Bia at verse 79 to help Antigonus out with her plan, but because she doesn't want to act in defiance of the city. But deep down, I feel that she sides with Antigone because at the end of the tragedy, she wants to pass as Antigone's accomplice. Lastly, I think that even here in this tragedy, the link I was commenting before about eubulia and phronesis is established here in some sense because when Tiresia is talking to Creon, namely to persuade him to let Antigonus live, he tells him that eubulia is the highest good. And then in the conclusive speech of the chorus, we read that tophronein is the first condition to be happy. So I think that also here there's a connection between these two, between eubulia and phronein. Then I conclude on this question, on this suggestion, could we expand the intertextuality of Xenophon and Aristotle about, about the lexicon of the deliberative process to Sophocles Antigonus? And if so, what does that tell us about Greek ethical reflection, the 5th and 4th century? So thanks for the attention.
Thank you very much, Chiara. What a rich and enlightening sort of expansion of Claudia Massico's chapter. Yeah, and bringing in genre again, while expanding our thoughts on genre. Why don't we pause for like maybe 2 or 3 minutes at this point if anyone has a response right away before we move on to our next scholar. Does anyone want to respond at this point? If not, we'll move on to our next. Yes, Gabriel.
I would just make a brief comment on this whole thing about Aristotle and Xenophon. You know, he has to have read it. You almost think, how could he not have read it? It's about all the subjects he's interested in, including Socrates, and yet he never mentions it. Maybe he didn't read it. If he did read it, then I'm accusing him of a boycott on Xenophon, and I'm not in favor of academic boycotts. And this boycott has had lasting effects because people who read Aristotle never read the word Xenophon anywhere in it.
And I just add, I think it's a boycott as well, from the perspective on women and slaves and the potential of sort of sidelined individuals. Aristotle disappoints us, and I think he was explicitly working against Xenophon on this score. But anyway, that's going to eventually appear, hopefully, in my book. Any other comments? Dave?
Yeah, speaking of plugging books, I'll make a plug for the a long-awaited and long-delayed Cyrus volume, which is there's a piece that Gabriel's going to have in it where he argues that Xenophon is not a tragic thinker, right? It's a piece that I found very valuable and illuminating. And so now this doesn't necessarily contradict what Chiara was saying because there's still deliberation in the Antigone. But if we think about how Antigone meets her end, right, when she comes back and mourns her death, her marriage to death, and that's tragic with a capital T, as opposed to how Socrates, particularly in Xenophon, meets his end with quips and no no lamentation, right? So at least in that respect, thanks to Gabriel, I think I've had to grapple with the fact that Xenophon may not be as tragic as all that. Anyway, I'll just thought I'd throw that in since it at least let me make a plug, and perhaps that will inspire me to do my job in trying to get the editing done on that volume.
And perhaps he's, explicitly working against tragedy also in the picture of the gods he gives us in memorabilia, these beneficent gods who, they're not the dark. How did Robert Parker describe them? The cruel and unkind gods of tragedy, perhaps it is. Any other comments? I suggest we move on then. Thanks to Chiara again. This was a wonderful response. We'll move
Thank
now
you.
to Milena. Milena Lozano Nembrot, doctoral student at Buenos Aires and Baralan University. We'll hand over to you now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Emily, and thank you very much for invite me. Malcolm Lowe has a comment. I don't know if, but he raised his hand. Oh no. Okay.
No, I just wanted to make a very simple point. I mean, it's a commonplace today that there are three branches of ethics: meta-ethics, normative ethics, or ethical theory, and applied ethics. I think that all the ethics of Xenophon, where you see it, is applied ethics. I mean, the things that interest him belong today in what you call the branch of applied ethics, whereas Aristotle is interested in ethical theory or normative ethics. So in terms of this tripart distinction, I think you can see why Aristotle does not mention at all Xenophon, but also on the other hand, Xenophon, does he ever mention Plato? I don't remember, but probably very little. You see, it's I say from today's viewpoint, Xenophon's main interest is in a different branch of ethics.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen. Can you see it in the full screen like that? Okay. So I will talk about Encrateia and Sophrosyne in the chapters, in like a group of chapters that I think they make like a unity. That is from 9 to 12, the chapters by Caroline Hanneman, Christopher Moore, Gabriel Danzig. He talked about it a little bit, and myself, my contribution to the book. I think these chapters had formed a thematic unit addressing from different perspectives to concepts fundamental to the study of Xenophon, that are Sophrosyne and Encrateia. I will briefly outline the central ideas of each chapter and then draw some connections and conclusions between them. First, like the conceptual background, we know that a lot of debate has been around the connection between Encrateia and Sophrosyne. Some say they are identical, or at least they overlap, like Louis André here and Fiorenza. And others says that there are different qualities, like Norrin Humble, Bodil Dew, or Norman also here, although in different ways. Another discussion is Encrateia and Carteria, if they are distinct or not. Louis André and Fiorenza says that Encrateia is the control of bodily pleasures and Carteria is the control of external forces, like heat, cold, and also pain. And others say that they're not clearly differentiated. So Caroline, in her chapter that is titled Laughing Matters, the ability to endure ridicule as a form of self-control, encrateia, akrasia, and carteria, addresses the much discussed problem of encrateia in Xenophon from an original point of view, presenting the ability to bear ridicule as an expression of the fundamental xenophontic virtue. To support her argument, Caroline undertakes a systematic examination of all occurrences of encrateia, akrasia, and carteria. She says that they all form a single concept of self-control, which is very polemic in a way, but encrateia and carteria. And she presented well organized in an appendix. So in this way, she defines encrateia as the ability to forego. She's against the Foucault's definition as encrateia as a struggle within the self. And she says it's the ability, based on a passage from Cyropaedia that I didn't quote here, she says it's the ability to forego present pleasure for greater future satisfaction. And she finds it applied in 6 areas: enduring hunger and thirst, going without sleep, withstanding heat and cold, engaging physical exertion, resisting erotic attraction, and only in 2 appearances, resisting the lure of money. So this is already like a more extended view of encrateia that it usually is like food, sex, drink, and sleep. Some comments about her like methodology that I found very interested, also to see other papers, to analyze other papers, is that what she's called that Xenophon show not tell strategy, that his work frequently depict aspects of self-control and other virtues also, without explicitly naming the relevant virtues. In this sense, the ability to endure ridicule is in essence a form of self-control, even if not labeled as such. That is her main argument. And another methodological point that I found very interesting and relevant is where she says that the overlap between certain terms, encrateia, carteria, and all that, and sophrosine even, also serves as a reminder not to become too attached to the dichotomies that have occurred in scholarship around the 2 terms: seeking pleasures versus avoiding pain, resistant to internal versus external challenges, the psychological versus the physical components of endurance. After all, Xenophon himself posits not such polarities, and in the right sense, and he's right, since, as a rule, human behavior plays out on a spectrum between 2 poles. Then going on to the next chapter, Christopher Moore, Sophrosine and Self-Knowledge in Xenophon and the 1st century. He studies the link between these 2 concepts and says that this link is well attested in Plato, Aristotle, and even certain understandings of the 5th century of Sophrosine. And Xenophon in this way is no exception, since, and this applies a little bit Caroline methodology of showing non-tell, although no character explicitly equates this concept, Socrates or no one, significant overlaps and connections emerge from the study of these 2 concepts. Plato and Xenophon view Sophrosine as the virtue. In this way, one of his main hypotheses is that Xenophon and also Plato view Sophrosine as the virtue of rational agency, or the capacity to treat as an authoritative for oneself the norms that rely are authoritative, or in other words, to recognize what principles for action unify oneself. In this sense, both self-knowledge and Sophrosine involve the recognition of authoritative action guiding norms, but while self-knowledge emphasizes recognizing such norms, Sophrosine emphasizes recognizing them as authoritative and therefore action guiding. The call to self-knowledge is a call to scrutinize one's beliefs, ensuring they're more than an opinion, And the call to Sophrosine is a call to live up those beliefs. Gabriel, in a way, will develop this idea in his own paper, in the chapter 11, which is called Sophrosine and Encrateia in Xenophon's writing. He already said a little bit his main thesis, but he said that Sophrosine and Encrateia are fundamentally different in nature, because Sophrosine is a behavioral virtue or a quality oriented toward action, as traditionally virtues were thought, while Encrateia, as a new term and a new virtue, is a psychological quality defined by its effect on the soul rather than by its external outcomes. While one guides action, the other involves internal struggle. And another point is that Encrateia, in this way, is an instrumental and neutral quality. Just one thing about the mental aspect of Sophrosine that maybe we can relate with more argument is that since intentional action presupposes a decision-making process, Sophrosine, as producing good action, can also be considered as a mental or intellectual quality. Xenophon, in fact, links it with Sophia, as also Dave said here, and opposes to mania. Thus, Sophrosine emphasized the behavioral aspect of Sophia. This raises a question: how does it relate this to Moore's thesis? Saying an action is intentional is not the same, I think, but I'm not sure, as saying is self-aware or has self-knowledge. So I wonder which of these does Sophrosine imply? Then some thoughts I had relating this paper with Caroline's methodology also. I think we have to be cautious by applying certain dichotomies, such as inner versus outer, body and soul, and in this case, psychology versus behavior, that might impose a rigid framework on Xenophon text that maybe is not there in the text themselves. Especially in an author like Xenophon, who, as Gabriel says himself in other place, focuses on the practical consequences of virtue and not on the delve into the nature of the soul or the self, like Plato. Maybe such dichotomies can be problematic. And I think this applies also as when describing Encrateia as a neutral quality, as I will try to show from my chapter. So chapter 12 is the problem of indiscipline, akolasia, and kolasis in Xenophon works. I studied here akolasia and discipline in Xenophon works. And I would like to say that mania and hybris are not the only opposite term to Sophrosine, but also akolasia. I did a small research of the development of akolasia and its opposite, Sophrosine, that in the 5th century had the general meaning of bad conduct, and then in the 4th century, it has the more specific meaning, although it kept the more general, more and more has the more specific meaning of excessive indulgence in pleasures. And that culminates in Aristotle, who formalizes at the opposite of Sophrosine and defines it as the mismanagement of pleasures. Xenophon only uses 3 times the adjective akolastos, but he uses a lot kolasis, and kolasis as corrective punishment plays a huge role in his moral and political philosophy. And studied these cases, I saw that the few uses of akolastos, Xenophon aligns more with the general 5th century usage of akolasia and as unpunished or undisciplined. And in this sense, akolasia, we know that comes from kolasis, which implies corrective punishments and relates to discipline as a kind of orderly or controlled conduct, as well as a method for achieving it. But however, Xenophon often attributes undisciplined behavior to a lack of control over appetites. In this way, he aligns with the 4th century authors who link sophrosine and akolasia through to the regulation of pleasures. So to go back to our theme, this is just some thoughts I've been having, but I have to develop it more. But I think that if the excess in pleasure is the main cause of disorderly behavior, then it's hard to think that enkrateia as a neutral quality. There's a strong connection both in the 1st century and particularly in Xenophon between the excess in pleasures and bad behaviors, and conversely between control over pleasure and good behavior. Consequently, although we can analytically and theoretically distinguish enkrateia from sophrosine, in practice they appear together and they're difficult to separate. In addition, Xenophon texts do not seem to allow room for considering potential negative consequences of self-control. So to conclude, these 4 articles and the whole book give us different approach to Xenophon virtues and vices, while Hahnemann urges us to move beyond binary distinctions and to pay attention to Xenophon's narrative strategies, more highlights the ethical and epistemic depth of sophrosune through its relation to self-knowledge. Danzig proposes a categorical distinction between virtues of action and virtues of soul, and my chapter tries to show the moral relevance of akolasia and kolasis, as well as the advantages of studying virtues from the perspective of vice. In conclusion, these 4 chapters converge in offering a richer, more nuanced understanding of the moral psychology in Xenophon works. They demonstrate, and the whole book, that concepts such as enkrateia and sophrosine, far from being rigid or interchangeable categories, are dynamic and context-dependent notions that reflect Xenophon's practical and often non-systematic approach to virtue. Taken together, along with the entire book, these studies undergo the complexity of Xenophon moral vocabulary and invite us to reconsider long-standing assumptions in the scholarship. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Milena. Another absolutely wonderful response. And you've, taken us on a wonderful whirlwind tour of 4 of the chapters. Wonderful insights there. Let's have just a couple of minutes, a few minutes now, if anyone has questions or responses to Milena's presentation. Raise your hand if you do. Malcolm?
Well, I think actually she's illustrated exactly the point that I was making at the beginning, that Xenophon is interested in the practical application of virtues. I mean, you see this in the memorabilia with all these little incidents of Socrates going about and encountering people, and they have ethical problems and he shows how to solve them. Also in the symposium of Xenophon, where Socrates is making these ethical comments at different places. I mean, when he sees this woman doing these acrobatics in the circle of fire and he says, look, you see, learn from this that women can be, women have the same ability for courage as men. The only difference is that women are not so strong as men, but in terms of courage, they're equal to men. So, and the other remarks he makes, like even when he says, let's stop all this fun, why can't we do something more serious, like which would teach us something and so on. So, and also in his economic, in his household, think about the household and so on. Again, it's, I mean, today, applied ethics is a major part of ethics, whereas in the ancient world, well, you find it in Xenophon, but I think the people who are doing applied ethics in the ancient world are less famous than ones who are doing ethical theory, whereas today they're recognized as 2 equally valid parts or branches of the 3 branches of ethics.
So there's a lot of applied ethics in Homer, for instance. Thank you so much for that, Dave. Can I hand over to you?
Sure. I was just going to comment that, I mean, I just picking up on Milena's last point where she, I think, disagreed with Gabriel about Encratea, right? And arguing that it doesn't, there doesn't seem to be room for a negative view of it. Um, I guess I would say that uh, it's possible that we have certain substrates, as I would call them, which may be Encratea and strength of soul, and perhaps the uh, philanthropia, the philomathia, philotomia that Cyrus has, that may have certain tendencies to push us in one direction or the other, but are also risky in some ways, right? So in other words, there might be a middle ground between traits that are always beneficial, which we will probably want to call virtues, and substrates which can be beneficial and may even be necessary for certain kinds of human excellence, but which can go in different directions. But thanks, Milena, for I think you did a nice job of pulling together a number of chapters of the book, um, and that is one big common theme in a lot of them is this Encratea Sophrosune complex in Xenophon. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll
Yes.
Okay, go ahead. No, Milena.
No, I remember when I studied like the history of the term Encrateia before it appears in the 5th century. There was some cases with the Kratos and Krateo, especially in Sophocles, that he warns about the soul that is too rigid, too encrates. I think in Antigone, I think there are these appearances which he compares with the strongest iron, and they don't and this trait doesn't allow the character to change their minds when it's necessary. So it could be negative, but I don't know if Encrateia considered specifically as the control of pleasures, especially in Xenophon, can be, but it is a question to raise. Yes, Gabriel, sorry.
Just a quick response on that. I also have like Dave, a kind of an intermediate position, which is that I think that Encrateia stops like 95% of the motivation for bad behavior, which is usually some kind of passion. But so it does have a huge influence, positive influence on moral behavior. But as Dave said, I don't think it had categorically determines that the behavior will be good. It just stops most of the bad.
Okay, let's hand over to Damon, and then after that we will move to our third and final speaker.
Thank you. Hi, Milena. I was curious about the connection between Encrateia and something like Colossus, maybe in the memorabilia when Socrates scolds Xenophon and for not seeing the risk in wanting to engage in sort of kissing, and so whether there's a connection there to draw between Encrateia and discipline, but also at the end of that passage, Xenophon notes that Socrates surrounded himself with beautiful students who were in the bloom of youth. And so I was curious whether that might also show a negative side of Encrateia, insofar as in comparison with Cyrus's refusal to even look at Panthea. And so whether there's, in Socrates' ability to surround himself with beautiful youths so that he can, teach or have discussion, whether that shows kind of the mean, I guess, of where Encrateia is rightly employed, whereas, what to make of Cyrus's response to Panthea in light of that.
Thank you. Well, regarding the first thing, yes, I think Colossus, the corrective punishment, can be a means in order to achieve Encrateia, and I think we see that especially in the Spartan society, like a very disciplined society, and this education from childhood that allows people to have an Encrates character very strongly. Regarding that passage, and this is a good point that you're making. I mean, it is true that Socrates is so encrates that he can face these beautiful boys, and like most people, actually, he recommends to stay away. I think everyone but Socrates must stay away. My opinion is also that enkrateia applies to aphrodisia, but not eros. Like eros is so big a force that you cannot control it even with enkrateia. That's my position. But if that is a good thing or a bad thing, I don't know. I mean, for Socrates, it's a good thing that he can be around boys, and maybe for the boys as well if they get educated. But it is true that from the more strict moral perspective can be maybe more subtle. I know. Thank you.
Richard, a very quick follow-up, and then we'll move to Bob.
Sorry, it took me, I forgot where the hand was in Zoom. Just very quickly, thinking about enkrateia sort of as a more ambivalent quality, virtue, whatever we want to call it. One area to think about is maybe its connection to potential tyrant figures, because I was just thinking of Jason of Pherae as a sort of figure who has a lot of enkrateia, but it's not very clear in Xenophon if, although it lets him do things that are situationally laudable, they can be in the service of a kind of master plan that may be more ambivalent. So just a thought there. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful, wonderful point to end there on. And now let's move on to our third and final speaker, Bob van Veldhoven. Again, I'm probably butchering your surname. My apologies, Bob, of
No
the
problem.
University of London. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Yes. Thank you, Emily. Thank you all for having me. And I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate Gabriel and Dave for the achievement they, the late David Konstan, and all the contributors have achieved with this wonderful volume. A volume dedicated to Xenophon and virtue has long been overdue, and has turned out to be a stimulating piece of scholarship, which has taught me a lot already and which will continue to intrigue me. In this response, I would like to ask you all to reflect on 3 questions dealing with the precise relationship between virtue and leadership models, questions which will highlight some of the key issues treated in this volume. I have noticed that most of these issues have already been touched upon in the initial discussion with Dave and Gabriel, but hopefully this response will allow us to reignite their discussion in the last phase of this meeting. In his wide-ranging introductory chapter of this volume, Gabriel Danzig does an impressive job of mapping out and categorizing Xenophon's conceptualization of virtue. As he shows, Xenophon conceives of virtue as being one, although it is comprised of what he calls several virtue qualities. Like Plato, Xenophon conceives virtue as a type of knowledge, not a hexis or cultivated habit of character, as Aristotle does. Unlike Plato and Aristotle, virtue is not situated in the soul, but Xenophon conceives it to be solely visible in action. Unlike Plato and Aristotle, Xenophon argues that the command of all virtues is founded upon enkrateia, a virtue quality that can easily be lost again. Virtue, therefore, is in constant need of imitation of an example, of being observed or trained to be maintained. Typical Xenophontic leaders, such as Socrates, Ischomachus, or Cyrus, thus fulfill a function towards their intertextual followers, as well as towards their historical readers. As Danzig himself on page 31 puts it, Xenophon seeks to make virtue visible to his readers as a prod to virtue. One of Xenophon's most characteristic insights is that all people need reminders if they are to succeed in achieving moral excellence, and that is necessary because of the instability of virtue. At the same time, Danzig touches upon a quality of Xenophon's writing that is very prominent in our own scholarly reading experience. Xenophon's virtue qualities are rarely clearly defined once, but always embedded in multiple works with historical narrative and literary contexts. For instance, Socrates' rendering of Ischomachus' conversation with his wife about Sophrosine in Economicus Book 7. Many of us want to unpack such a passage and compare it to the other instances in which Sophrosine is mentioned and see how it compares But is that how Xenophon meant for us to read the text? My first question is about these two reading experiences and to what extent they overlap with Xenophon's intentions as an author. To what extent do we think that Xenophon really was theoretically interested in coming up with new definitions of virtue qualities? And was this something his readers may have appreciated? Or was Xenophon more interested in moving his readers to virtue in general through examples, and spelling out the exact virtue qualities they had merely helpful for readers to process these examples? Moreover, to what extent did Xenophon find it possible to define virtue qualities without using examples or of leaders? In other words, is the instability of virtue that Danzig mentions not only due to the necessity of enkrateia, but also because Xenophon thinks that virtue, upon defining it, crumbles and disintegrates in our hands and remains undefinable if it is not connected to concrete examples? My second question, relating to the first one, is about Xenophon's position towards the use of virtue language in discourse. In his stimulating second chapter, Christopher Tuplin points out the tension in the analysis between the philosophical discourse of virtues and the demand for practical and effective leadership in times of need. This tension is most explicit in the remark of Valinus to Theopompus in Book 2 of the Analysis, whereas Theopompus argues that the Greeks have two good things, their weapons and their arete, which they should not surrender to Artaxerxes because they would not be able to defend their arete afterwards. Valinus responds that philosophical discussions about arete are out of place in their deliberation because the arete of the Greeks is not the thing that is going to defeat the might of the Persian king. And he thus thinks that Theopompus is deluded by his own rhetoric about arete. Valinus, in the end, is wrong. The Persians could not be trusted, and moral quality is a matter worth discussing. Tuplin, however, reads Valinus' remark as metapoetical for the status of virtue discourse in the rest of the analysis. Although the conduct of the good leaders in analysis, such as Xenophon, exemplifies virtue, the narration generally avoids the verbal and analytical terms of abstract, ethical, philosophical, or formally encomiastic discourse, as Tuplin puts it. And the message of the analysis is thus that sometimes demonstrating virtue is more important and more veracious than talking about it. My second question is thus about to what extent we can continue such a reading for the rest of Xenophon's works. If Xenophon here considers excessive praise of virtue distracting from examples of good leadership, what does that say about the other passages in which Xenophon praises the virtue qualities of, for instance, Cyrus the Elder or Socrates? Should we, when Xenophon praises someone's virtues, not be more attentive to his rhetorical strategies, playfulness with discourse types, and fulfillment of generic conventions? Or is that something we have already sufficiently doing? A third and final question that I've come up with after reading the contribution of late David Konstan is about the following. David Konstan's afterwards should, in my opinion, not be regarded as an afterthought, but rather as a prerequisite reflection before delving into the study of Xenophon's virtues. Konstan argues that our interest in Xenophon's virtue cannot be properly understood without understanding how we ourselves are grounded in the modern philosophical tradition of virtue ethics. Although Xenophon and his contemporaries indeed wrote extensively on virtues, Konstan wonders whether we may over-apply the term in the Xenophonic studies. In his witty style, Konstan conducts a thought experiment and asks us to compare Xenophon's praise of Agesilaus' virtue qualities with the following hypothetical situation. You can read this on page 477. Suppose I were asked to describe the outstanding characteristics of a friend, and I were to say, he is honest to a fault, an excellent swimmer, frugal in his habits, quite handsome, comes from a fine family, is liberal in his politics, is an observant Catholic, has remarkable stamina, and has a wonderful sunny disposition. What is more, everybody likes him. Konstan says, you might well want to meet this person, but it is not clear that this list of superlative attributes constitutes a set of virtues, as we normally understand the term. As Konstan makes evident, not every character trait mentioned has to be a virtue quality, but we are likely to treat them as such if they are mentioned as such in the Agesilaus, for instance. I would like to ask you whether you think this afterward should change the way virtue has been treated throughout the volume. How could we benefit from reflection, what virtue is as such, and what is to be gained or lost if we subsume any doubtful cases of what virtue is under the name of virtue? Thank you very much, and I'm looking forward to your thoughts on these questions.
What a wonderful concluding response. Thank you so much, Barb. Let's open up the floor. Any responses, comments, questions for Barb? And I'll give people some time to find the hand button.
Well, not forgetting that there were also questions for Gabriel and Dave, I would say.
I've been talking so much, I'd like to hear other people.
Dave has his hand up, so.
Yeah, I'm happy to yield too, but I just thought I'd say that I think that Bob's approach is really useful, right? To think about Xenophon making, why did he choose not to be more philosophical, right? And rather than just, I don't know what the default assumption is, right? That I tend to make, which is that, I think a lot of people tend to make the default assumption is that he's just disinterested or incapable, right? Rather than making a authorial choice or a choice as a teacher who believes that the best way to improve people is precisely not to define things. So I just thank him. I just wanted to thank him for that suggestion.
Yeah, and this interest of Xenophon's in like a positive interest, and not an inability to do philosophy, but a positive interest in, as has been coming up in the real world examples, and in history, and and the sorts of real instances on the ground where things might be more complicated than when you take maybe a more philosophical, more abstracted distance. Do we have more comments? We also, and I neglected to notice these in time, we did have some comments in the chat as well. But do we have more comments at all for Barb? But let me just briefly, while everyone's thinking, go back to the chat. We had a comment from Rodrigo, who's now had to leave. But let me see if I can find it. Yeah, he mentioned that the beginning of Aristotle's Politics looks like an answer to Xenophon Economicus. Some people think that the qualifications of a statesman, king, householder, and master are the same. Absolutely, I'm in agreement with Rodrigo that is a that is a pointed response to Xenophon's disagreement with Xenophon. But yeah, more.
So let me just address that quickly, which is that we pointed out, someone mentioned that, does Plato mention anyone? Does Xenophon mention Plato? They didn't mention each other, but Aristotle does. It might be a difference of genre, because he's not writing the dramatic dialogue. You don't supposed to mention other authors in the dramatic dialogue, but still, he mentions a lot of people. So why doesn't he mention Xenophon? I think that it's a question.
And we only really have 5 minutes remaining. We thought an hour and a half would be enough time that we can keep people at an online event. So let's open up the floor. Any comments that come up for Barb, or further comments, or otherwise more general responses to anything that has been said today, or to anything else in this wonderful tone. Luke.
Yeah, well, I'd still be just interested in kind of hearing people on kind of the final point Bob raised. So what is it when I say that, Bob's a really nice guy and that? Why is that not a list of virtues, and why is it in Agesilaos, let's say? I still think that's a good question. Maybe Bob wants to rephrase it. I don't know, but I I think that does get to the heart of some of the things we have been talking about, namely the difference, the sensitivity to genre and that sort of thing.
And it also, like your list there, or Bob's, the David Konstan's wonderful list, perhaps also relevant to it, is the extent to which Xenophon seems to think that a friendly disposition, a person who is is good at being a friend and connecting others in friendship, that this is relevant to being virtuous as well. So that maybe complicates things a little bit as well, in that, your way, and we see this in Symposium when, Socrates sort of chastising people who are being too snippy and not relating to one another in a way that's conducive to building up friendship. And of course, Enkrateia in Memorabilia too, brought out as really it's fundamental to friendship, as well as being fundamental to sort of a virtuous capacity. So that might be relevant as well. Christopher.
Yeah, one answer to Bob's question, or to David Konstan's question, is maybe that we are heir to too many centuries of a certain type of way of thinking about ethics, that is, if you like, the Platonic Aristotelian one, which has elevated certain types of human behavior to the category of virtues while ignoring others. I mean, it's obviously true that the things in the passage Bob quoted is full of this guy sounds very nice. Of course, it's true. We all know from experience that people can have an awful lot of nice qualities, particularly ones that are socially comfortable, if you like, make you feel comfortable with people. They may still behave extremely badly in certain respects and in certain contexts. And maybe we kind of want to try to handle that by cleaving to the notion that there are special qualities that we call virtues that we would use if we were pushed to try and determine whether a person is a good person, not just a nice person in his social interactions, so far as we are aware. I mean, it's too much Plato and Aristotle, not enough Xenophon, maybe is the problem.
We do have everything, so.
I mean, can I also, I mean, the practical ethics thing, I mean, Emily remarked there's a lot of practical ethics in Homer. I mean, there's a lot of practical ethics in most of what we call Greek literature. Tragedy, we were speaking about, tragedy is full of deliberation about ethical questions. It's also, incidentally, where you look to find strong women. So Xenophon should have had a certain interest in tragedy, though it wouldn't necessarily make him want to be the creator of tragic texts. I mean, even within the different genres he's working in. So the two aren't necessarily incompatible. But I mean, an awful lot of Greek literature has been engaged in had always been engaged in the exercise of practical ethics. In a way, I mean, it is the Platos and the Aristotles. It is the people who seek to crystallize out of that, or to create out of that, a different sort of discourse, which is analytical rather than, if you like, ordinary language descriptive, who are the odd ones out. I mean, Xenophon isn't the odd one out in those terms. It's Plato and Aristotle, and that sort of tradition of doing philosophy, which is no doubt a perfectly legitimate one. But I mean, Xenophon, as a student of history, as presumably an experiencer in his youth of the theatrical discourse of Athenian culture, and as an experiencer of the Socratic discourse of, well, practical ethics. I mean, he ends up bringing together all these strands into particular types of discourse in a bewilderingly building variety of generic contexts, none of which is tragic or theatrical exactly, all of which dip into the Socratic, that's where he comes from, but he's not the odd one out.
Well, I think, Christopher, thank you so much. I think that was a wonderful note on which to end. I just heard it
It wasn't meant to be a note on which to end.
No, I just heard it time 2 p.m. here in Chapel Hill.
Came out like
And I
that.
think this is very appropriate, having our the first president of the International Xenophon Society kind of closing us out in that way. So let me just thank, first of all, our speakers. This was really wonderful. The editors, our three respondents. We had the idea of a kind of author meets critic with, bringing some junior scholars in to respond. And I thought that you did a wonderful job. So thank you so very much. And hopefully we'll have another Xenophon Society event soon, and we'll see you all again there. Have a wonderful afternoon or evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.